Hello and welcome to Oddball Reviews. I am your host, L.W. Greenwood. Today we'll be taking a look at The Lord of the Rings, and I will be doing all three books in one go. I don't want to do each individual one. Um, Again, it seems a bit normal to be going over uh, something like The Lord of the Rings as the oddball reviewer. I do actually much prefer stranger topics, and The Lord of the Rings is definitely normal. Of course, I read it a long time ago when I was a kid, and I absolutely loved it. In fact, I even tried to write a knockoff of it. It didn't pan out, but it's definitely one of the most influential stories, period. I'm not sure there's any that can really top it in its influence in the world. I think everybody knows that, though. And the reason it's so influential is because prior to J.R.R. Tolkien doing what he did, nobody wrote fantasy for adults. It was fairy stories, it was children's stories. It was more like what The Hobbit was, just a story for kids. But J.R.R. Tolkien took it seriously and he did very well. Like, there are better books out there. I grant you there are. Better plot lines, better characters, hard to top his theme, but that's neither here nor there. But J.R.R. Tolkien did it first, and he did it really well. I don't think there's anyone in the world who will argue that point. Um, I might even actually be the only one who would be willing to argue it a little bit. But anyway, the thing though is it is a bit. It does have its issues, at least in my opinion. And we'll go over those a little bit. But first, I think we should go do a little summary because maybe some people haven't watched the movies or read the books. It's hard to think of in this day and age, but heck, you never know. Frodo meets Gandalf. Well, he didn't meet him, he already knew him, but he learns about the ring and that it is actually, in fact, the One Ring, and in order to end Sauron's evil rule, he must destroy it. And so Gandalf leaves him and has Bill Frodo bring it back later. Anyway, they go to Rivendell. They meet their fellowship, and that seems pretty bog standard for many fantasy stories to get a party together and go on an adventure. But you got to remember that this is the first one. Like, I would complain about that point if it were not for the fact that before this, oh, it might have existed. I mean, you've got the Iliad and stuff like that. Not the Iliad. Yeah, it's the Iliad. Anyway, the point is that gathering a bunch of allies and going on an epic journey is pretty bog standard. But I do believe that the fellowship that gets put together in the fellowship is very well done. Every character, with the possible exception of Legolas, is a unique and interesting character, and we love all of them, even Legolas. I mean, it may be hard for some people to understand what I mean by that, but he really doesn't have much character in the books. Like, there's not much going on. He's an elf, and that's about it. Anyway, as far as the adventure goes, like, yeah, they go on a big adventure. Of course, it gets broken up, and then it becomes several different stories spanning half a continent or whatever. And I believe Frodo's part of it was obviously the most interesting but everything worked together very well. Like in The Hobbit, I feel like things could have been edited out and it wouldn't have mattered. I mean, what was the point of the trolls? Like the whole scene with the trolls was just a mini adventure along the way, and it didn't really uh, add much to the story at all. However, in The Lord of the Rings, everything has a purpose. It feels like it's moving the story along, with the possible exception of Tom Bombadil. But yeah, most everything is moving the story, and it's a progression that feels, I wouldn't say perfect, but just like it was meant to be. that's a hard, that's a bad way of putting it, I should say, but it all feels like there's continuity. Everything feels like it's supposed to be that way, and it just works. Unlike a lot of stories where it just feels like we're doing things to do things. I'm getting off on this tangent. As far as the characters, is my second point. All of the characters are good. When I first read the books, I really didn't like Merry and Pippin until they met the Ents. Once they met the Ents, then they became my favorite characters. And at first, I loved Frodo, but I'll be honest, he's probably my least favorite character anymore because he's a great character, but there's nothing really special about him, especially after he comes back to the Shire and then he becomes just this. I don't want to say depressed. It doesn't really seem that way in the books, but it doesn't feel like he belongs there anymore. He doesn't even feel like a hobbit. I don't know. Anyway, it becomes a little bit strange in my mind. But then you've got Sam, and Sam is the greatest of all time. I'm serious. Like, I can't think of many characters in any book that I've ever read that I preferred over Sam. Sam was the best. Aragorn was a great character. Gandalf is obviously a great character. Probably the ones with the least interesting about them is Gimli and Legolas. And Gimli has more to his character than the others, than Legolas. But yeah, most characters in it do are good characters, likable. The female characters, eh, there's not much there. Like neither in the books or even the movies. Well, the movies have make them a little bit better, but really, outside of Galadriel, the female characters are just there. I mean, Eowyn obviously has her own arc, and it's good, but her love story with Aragorn, I don't know. It felt shoehorned in and didn't really work all that well for me. But it is what it is. It's a classic story, and it has some pretty classic characters. And uh, the fact that most of those characters ended up becoming more of an archetype for a long time, uh, with the way people essentially tried to rip off the Lord of the Rings. Um, it's hard to argue that there's anything wrong with them. Anyway, the next point is like the writing style. And as far as the writing style, it's definitely made for an older, not an older audience, an older time. And I feel like that would have been true even when it first came out. Like the amount of music in the book, um, I don't think that would have been popular in literature even at that time. Like it wasn't meant for a modern audience. And you can tell by the language, it feels like it was meant to, I don't know, be the Middle Ages or something. And that's definitely not the time in which uh, J.R.R. Tolkien lived. He lived in the modern world, but I think that was the entire point. Is it felt like, well, the whole theme, of course, is the fact that the new is replacing the old, and I think that was his writing style, was the old style, but the new is coming in and taking over. But you can kind of feel it in just how one of J.R.R. Tolkien's biggest problems is head hopping. You sometimes don't even know whose head you're actually in a scene, and then sometimes it'll just change without notice. I remember one particular one where it was in Mary's point of view, and then suddenly it wasn't anymore, and he wasn't even part of the scene, and it just felt weird that he was supposed to be the point of view character, but he had absolutely nothing to do with the scene. If you're wondering which one it is, it's the one where they meet the wild men. But anyway, things like that happen a lot in the story, and that's a big no-no in today's writing. But back then, I feel like it wasn't as much. And there's a few other things that just I feel like it's not that it was wrong, but writing has changed since then, and just the way the language is, I feel like it was a very slow book, especially the first part of it, which I personally never had a problem with. I actually enjoy slow books, but for a modern audience, it may be a slog to get through. But anyway, as far as my personal rating of it, I think I would give it a solid 7 out of 10. And I know a lot of people may hate that because they think it should probably be, 10 out of 10. I don't believe there's really such a thing as a 10 out of 10. But it's mostly down to my own personal taste. I am the oddball reviewer, and as such, I prefer more odd things. And I think The Lord of the Rings is a very generic story. I mean that in the sense that it's a very, oh, the hero goes off to save the world type of story. And I personally don't really like those stories anymore, even though my first book is that story. But um, it's so generic that, which I shouldn't say that. The Lord of the Rings is only generic because of all of the people who've essentially copied him over the years. He wasn't generic in his time and probably shouldn't be thought of that way, but personally, in my opinion, I would rather see a more odd story, which, since I do the uh, Strange-O-Meter, uh, its rating as strange is pretty much maybe a 4. Like, it's not really that strange. Uh, it's got classic fantasy elements to it, and there's nothing particularly different about it from any other story. Um, I mean, obviously, the same caveat as before, but like when I mean strange, I mean it takes your ordinary characters and or your ordinary story and flips it on its head so that, I don't know, the badass killer protagonist is made to be a farmer or something like that. That's the kind of stuff I want to see. And The Lord of the Rings is pretty bog standard. But anyway, I'm going on way too long. In conclusion, I think it's a really good book that any nerd should read. If you haven't read The Lord of the Rings, you need to read The Lord of the Rings. Um, but personally, it's not my favorite book by any measure. I'm not even sure it would end up in the top 10 for me, but you should still read it. Anyway, I am the Oddball Reviewer, and thank you for watching. If you would check out my book, Embers in the Wind, it would make me very happy. Um, anyway, stay odd, my friends.